first of all, from Robin and I, a big thank you. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to, guess what, do a Zoom call. I mean, how bizarre is that you've made time for an extra one? So we really are appreciative and look forward to this. But I hope will be a conversation to kick off a discussion on this rather important topic as we see it, at least at the moment. So I'm going to start the process. Robin's going to come in and talk about some of the personal experiences of those leaders who we visited and interviewed along the way. But we're going to try and sort of make it interactive by getting some feedback from you to help set the scene for this. Okay, so just a quick straw poll. How many of you have been involved in recruiting a new VC or equivalent, or are anticipating doing in the next year or two? Hands up if you've got a perspective on this. Oh, do a quick poll. Why don't we do a quick poll? 1, 2, yes, 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 yes. Not yet. Yes, yes, yes. Getting there. So yeah, nearly 80% of you have had the experience of being involved in this, which is great to see, and we want to sort of build on that and get your sense of what's worked, what's been less successful, if anything, in the process. So the focus today, through the lens of this book, which Robin and I have just published, is on VCs, but we hope it's also relevant to many other senior roles, be it DVCs, provosts, PVCs for that matter, and indeed in your own roles as Chief Operating Officer or University Secretary, Head of Governance, and so on. So we'll see whether you see the connectivity between some of the themes which we highlight. So we're going to look at a number of topics. We're going to look at, first of all, your perspective on the current approaches to leadership appointments and transitions at the top. We're going to look at that which is very familiar to, with 80% of you having been involved in it, the roles you've played or expect to play in the process, and then perhaps come back to that theme towards the end with some suggestions of further roles which you may already be playing or might become even more significant in our view as you go forward. What is it that makes for success in the process from the appointment through the post-appointment phase, during the early days and beyond? What is it that leads to success? And what are some of the early warning signs, if any, that you've seen, at least, of a problematic transition, which, if it's not addressed, could lead to derailment in the extreme, or just a less than satisfactory process where it's rather difficult to see how to recover from. But it's not that bad that it's demanding urgent action, if you like. We're going to try and do that within the time we've got, plus leaving a good time for questions and comments as we go through and towards the end as well. So normal recruitment practice: search, select, job done. You may have a view on that, and I'm interested in what else. Transitioning, normal practice, it's probably a letter, a quick chat with the outgoing VC, job done. You may have views on that also. So in a Chatham House context, I'd like you to reflect on the following question, which we're then going to do a quick straw poll just to get a sense check on your perspective on the sector as a whole. This may not be reflective of your particular institution, which may be exemplary, but thinking of the sector as a whole, the effectiveness of current approaches to leadership appointments and transitions at the top in HE. In a few minutes, you might vote for an unquestionably excellent. Tom, there's absolutely no need for any change whatsoever. I don't know why you've written this book. Can we move on? There's a few tweaks here and there could help, but it's fundamentally pretty fit for purpose. Could do with a bit of fresh thinking. We really do need a debate and make some changes. Or frankly, we need some radical change. Our current approaches, practices are not fit for today and certainly not for the future. And I'm going to invite you to anonymously judge where you see that at the moment for the sector as a whole. We're fascinated to see where it's. It's not quite job done, and whilst search selection, many times it works okay, but if we look at the sector as a whole, we think it's a bit suboptimal and there's room for improvement. And we want you to be really, we see you as a community as absolutely vital to this. And so we would like to test our initial thinking. The book's really about what we're just about to unpack, but the second part of the book really is about the different parts to the role and how the role is changing, some of the data about how do you get into the role in the first place, and then some of the staging points along the route in your first few years as you go about fulfilling the role. But we're going to focus predominantly on this appointment process, and it's worth looking elsewhere sometimes. This from 2017 from Canada, for example, is an interesting read. The two keys: choose the right person, provide them the right support. If you don't have the rights of either, then you really have got an uphill struggle. If the incoming president tells you that no transition or mentorship is required, you might want to think again. But getting the right person is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And they explain a little more about their experience, often, as in many countries, and lessons of experience from less than satisfactory transitions which have taken place. And we spend quite a lot of time, we'll touch on that in a few minutes also. But it's not about just getting there. Without going into the detail, which we don't have time to do, we mapped what we felt were the key component elements of the process from the very start of why do you want to be there, what's your motive, to the process of physically becoming appointable and appointed, and then the transitions as you go through the role. But we're focusing very much on the sort of getting to there and arriving phase. The rest is much more, more to follow. And the baton passing, much as it's a fantastic metaphor, because, really racing is obviously key to the whole process. It's something done at speed, lots of opportunity, sync, safe pair of hands, one baton, and it is a spectator sport watched by many on the sports field. Leadership transitions in HE are a bit different. There's a lot more laps often. There's really only one chance to get it right. Your leaders may or may not be in sync. Sometimes they want to hold on to their baton. Usually you need a lot more than one safe pair of hands to make it work. But it is also a spectator sport that's watched by many. So it has some cognizance, but it's not the only sporting metaphor you could use. Crucial to the whole process is teamwork, as we'll see also. Another sports metaphor, sometimes helpful in multi-stage transitions, where you've got, as some of you may have experienced, an interim Vice-chancellor stood down, there's an interim in place whilst the new Vice-chancellor arrives. And therefore that multi-stage, as one of the teams I was working with recently said, it's more like a peloton race. You're up there at the front, but then you sneak back into the pack again as somebody else comes to do some of the heavy lifting or take the pace up during that multi-stage transition. So to some extent, these metaphors get you so far in the process. But our metaphor was a slightly different one, and I'm going to pass the baton in that sense to Robin to talk about the web of transitions and themes related to that. Robin.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I mean, the thing that we became aware of through our interviews with retired and serving heads of university, plus a number of other people involved in the process, was that it's rarely the case that when you're appointing or welcoming a new VC principal, that theirs is the only transition that's going on. There are several others, and that complicates it. So, for example, I mean, you've already mentioned the governing body and the members of the governing body, in particular the chair, but not just, members of the senior team, and indeed one or more of them may have been a candidate as well for this appointment. So their transitions are highly relevant to the new person. And then, very importantly, the people in the VC president's office, and because they're going to be interacting very closely, and of course you yourselves and your roles. So those transitions make this particular transition of the incoming person more complicated, and they can again have quite an impact on that individual, obviously. So the question really is, how can this web of transitions be navigated successfully? I'll just leave that hanging for the moment and go on to the next one, Tom. The other, the whole book is written in, to an individual wanting to go into this role, so being there and exiting from the role. And so in that context, one of the chapters is about the individual as a human being, and how they deal with the role, how they think about it, how they prepare themselves, and how they cope with it. And these are quotes from people who are taking on the role. You'll be caught off guard by how much of yourself you have to put in. We also include research from other sectors, and indeed research on heads of institutions from other countries. But CEO success highlights some of the intangibles of leadership that can come to the fore in critical moments of truth. And then you've already, Amanda, I think it was you who mentioned the issue of values and how important those are. This again is a quote from a head of institution about how important the alignment of values is. So that leads to the question, which again you've touched on, I think, before, is how do you assess character and values and beliefs in the selection process? How do you identify them? How can you? The argument from the CEO success stories is that you have to find ways of getting at these critical moments of truth more directly. Okay, Tom. And then we look at how individuals talk to individuals about how they cope with the job and how they survive. And they talk about needing a lot of self-discipline, resilience, and the ability to achieve separation, both psychological. It's not about you necessarily, it's about the role. And then physical, everything from sport to keeping a journal to thinking about a problem in research terms. How can you do an analysis of what's going on here? And then they also talked about things that were helpful to them, which the institution can put in place. The ability to give them feedback, to provide support, give space, etc. And then we looking at leadership transitions again in other sectors. A comment from one set of authors was that to make the difference between surviving and thriving, two kinds of inner strength are needed. Firstly, transition capabilities such as self-awareness, being able to seek and hear feedback from other people about how you're doing and what's happening, a willingness to change, and an ability to experiment. And then to keep yourself fundamentally open to change and deeper learning. So it's a journey about yourself and what you learn about yourself and your impact on the world. And a confidence, particularly if you're going through change yourself, you have to be able to hold uncertainty for yourself and for those around you and the organization. So the the question that applies there, what can be put in place to help leaders survive and then thrive in the role from your experience? So I turn to you, Tom. You want to
just pause for a second for reflections on that issue of what are we assessing. As one member of the interviews I did, I remember said, you see, up to this point, Tom, I was assessed on whether I could get stuff done. And then suddenly when I get into this job, I was being assessed on my values. And that was shouldn't have been such a shock, but it really came out of the blue as to how significant that dimension was. But that sort of question of how would, perhaps you've got some ideas, how would you assess for character, values, beliefs, and other ways in which that can be accelerated in the process? Well, we've got comments from 2 or 3 of you, if you've got any ideas on that theme to kick us off. Yeah, Rachel, come on in.
Hi, Tom and Robin.
See you.
I think there's got to be more use at the interview stage of really challenging scenarios. So I know that the default position is to allow the candidates to meet with different stakeholder groups, and that's all well and good. But the feedback I hear from people who've been involved in those kinds of focus groups for VC appointments say that they often feel they don't get the chance to pose the really challenging stuff. So I would recommend a really, really worst case scenario being presented to the candidates with the opportunity for them to talk through some of those really, really challenging ethical dilemmas that they might find themselves in. And I don't know how many universities do that.
Yep, thank you. I love it, Andrew. Have every candidate play around at Monopoly with the SLT insights. Yeah, John, please come in.
A couple of thoughts. One of the best examples I've seen is where the student union was given the chance to run role play with the candidates, and they did it live, and then an emergency arose and people had to deal. The other bit I think is I don't think you can actually judge people's values, but you can observe their behaviours. And so yes, the challenge for me is for boards and leadership teams to think about their values in terms of what behaviours would you look to see to demonstrate those values, and then try and test and observe that through an interview process.
Very good, like it. Okay, well, let me segue on to the next part of the jigsaw and continue the opportunity for you to ask other questions as we go. So let me just close that down. And the roles you play already are fairly self-evident. And several years ago, thinking about this, you know, there's a sort of internal facilitator role that you and others might play, but you're in the roles you're in, play a vital role in that sort of interplay between the various players, particularly the inner leadership team. So you're involved in the process of putting together a selection process, an appointment process, keeping business as usual going, as we used to call it, between the current leader and the senior leadership team, thinking about the post-appointment phase and how that should be handled, and then the early days in office. So it's not that you don't do lots already, you do, and it's just reinforcing those critically important roles which you already play. I'm going to add a few more to those towards the end of the presentation. But there's also a role you play traditionally in the connectivity between the new leader and the different stakeholders, partners, funders, students, clients, etc., and orchestrating that process so that they accelerate into role and are introduced, because this is a major decision to appoint a new Vice-chancellor, the criticality of the transition from an external perspective being clear. And of course, in a COVID context, with all the challenges that go of how to do that and how to do it well. I think Robin and I got about halfway through the book when we realised there was a missing chapter and had to write it in real time as we were living through the last year in COVID and indeed seeing how different vice-chancellors were managing the process. I found myself at one point, and it still remains, working with 4 new vice-chancellors individually, and then decided to ask the question of them, would you be interested in coming together as a foursome to meet in a virtual action learning group, which they thankfully said they would be interested in trialing. And 15 months later, we're meeting every 6 weeks as they have a community within which they can actually share experiences with each other. But often they were sharing experiences of how these different phases of the transition and processes post-appointment had happened. I mean, the success is building on many of the ideas which you were suggesting earlier. There's a sort of classic, search and selection and appointment and the induction processes significantly where a lot of effort is invested, and rightly so. We're not here saying none of that matters. Of course, it's fundamentally important. But there's a number of other elements which we wanted to try and start the process, and it's a work in progress, so refinement's welcomed, to look at it beyond that. And we call it integrated leadership transitions. It's really looking at a more strategic, a more future-focused, a more coordinated and relationship-oriented approach with a team focus. Many of the elements I'll show you, you will see exist. What doesn't seem to often have the same traction is a coordination of all of the different dimensions of this. So it's not replacing search and selection, but it's really about diagnosing real needs, accelerating entry, delivering high performance, and about particularly reducing the risk of a less than optimum, and in rare cases, appointment which leads to an early exit from the role, but something that really allows the person to really land well, accelerate into a role, and really be very, very successful in those critically important early stages. If there was one big thing, we didn't find it. It was lots and lots of little things that cumulatively nudged the odds in favor of success. And it's capturing those nuggets of lessons from our experience, but we'd welcome your engagement in the process. So let's look at a few where else. Well, I think the pre-search phase is really crucial. And it happens, and it sometimes happens very systematically, but often it doesn't. We know what we don't want is sometimes what I hear, but we're not quite sure what we do want. So one example which we cite, and I remember vividly being involved in an exercise with a university, which was working out what sort of university do we want to be in the future, and then deciding what sort of leadership we need in order to get to where we wish to be. And so a scenario planning exercise by the governing body led to a very clear mandate and a very clear set of criteria for the type of leader that they were seeking to identify. And that, again, intuitively should and often is informing thinking, but again, getting the governing body active in the process at an early stage can often be quite a fulfilling experience and force the debate beyond what might be the normal conventional appointment process that we might undertake. So there's the pre-select process, very top left, transition team formation. Again, we see this in other countries more than the UK presently, rather than a search committee, actually having a team who are actually going to handle and think about the wider transition experience during the entire process. Pre-selection, the candidate assessment after the search is the second area which we wondered about. And the classic search and selection model typically, but not exclusively, but it typically is, there's a degree of candidate assessment that takes place, typically coordinated by the search firm. And that has its merits, and it's straightforward, it's easy, they're very much engaged with the sometimes they do it themselves, sometimes they have a third party, occupational psychologists do the work. Our question was, what if it was actually something which was much more driven from the selecting body, from the institution, that they have to evaluate and consider the criteria for candidate assessment. Now, this is well beyond a few psychometrics, which may or may not inform the final decision, but actually are about that sort of future capabilities, that process of thinking about the type of leader we wish for the future, and the values, behaviours which would be associated with somebody who would fit the organisation, not just of today, but particularly of tomorrow. So a shift of the focus from the assessment, it begs the question, and I think it is one for you and your colleagues to consider, but do we have the internal expertise to do that? My question is, if we don't, what do we do to build it? Because I think it's rather important that it is independent of the search process, which has a rightful important role and takes a lot of work out of the institution. But question, could we do more on guiding and being independent of the search firm? As we get into the post-appointment phase, I think there's a number of elements, again, we would flag as important, many of which relate to points you made earlier. Because I think the post-appointment transition up to the arrival is a period during which many things can actually help and support or hinder the process. One of them is simply the holding the ring with the senior leadership team. Those of you who've been through this will know the heightened level of anxiety that inevitably arises within senior leadership teams in that transition period, and how you maintain momentum on the current agenda and how you provide the necessary support to the senior leadership team and the existing VC during that period can be rather important. Post-appointment performance and development plan, what's that all about? Well, that's actually the chair of the board and the board itself being clear about what does success look like earlier in the process, and what is a development plan to enable that success to be achieved for the incoming candidate. And sometimes that takes place very explicitly, sometimes it's intuitive, sometimes it's something that comes much later. Again, I think to guide the new incumbent in role, giving them very clear sense of a co-created agenda, often, of what the success and a performance plan look like at this early stage can be enormously valuable. And during that sort of transition period, it seems to me there's, the vital role you again can play in helping maintain momentum, helping prepare the way for the new leader to land well. You do this as well, but also start working on issues of immediate importance to accelerate entry and engagement. And I've had a couple of recent examples where I've seen real progress on that with a transition team who've been really capitalizing on doing work on behalf of the incoming Vice-Chancellor to really accelerate progress in that first critical 3 to 6 months after they arrive. So just thinking about, again, nudging the odds in favor of success. Post-arrival, there's all the usual stuff that you're very familiar with, the team, both formation and reformation on occasions, a shared governance agenda, being clear that, again, one of the big step up, if you've not been a previous Vice-Chancellor, is that huge significance of the engagement with the board. I don't think there was one of our interviewees, Robin, who did not emphasize you just don't realize how much time you will have to spend rightly on governance matters. And that becomes a huge, significant part of the new role and getting that off to a good start. And also, whatever it takes in the way of coaching and mentoring support through that early phase in role. Robin?
Just one thing to add to the governance issue is that we also had an example, well, somebody who very candidly said, and they were mid-term in their new institution, so been several years, and they spent a lot of time in the beginning with members of the governing body, but then didn't continue that, and then a crisis emerged, and then there was very quickly had to do a lot of nifty footwork really to keep the board and each member of the board on side during a difficult time. So it's not just the beginning, it's a continuing issue.
It is. And when the change of course, of board chair takes place, the person who's appointed you then is no longer there. You then have a relationship development process with the new chair, and so it goes on. But that huge amount of effort required there. Finally, just to touch on the topic of the warning signs of a problematic transition, chapter 13, if you're interested, you will get a bit more on that. Most do, some don't. I remember hearing the story of the ABC model of leadership. I don't know if you've come across this one. It's the arrive, blame, criticise, demand, compliance. The trouble is the ABCD models proponents forget there's usually an E that comes next, so be careful. It's a delicate balance to get right. What are some of the early signs? And again, we tried to distill from both our experience, our read around the literature, but also the insights from many others who'd experienced and had to deal with these. And we would identify 3 different types of issues which can arise. Andrew Boggs, come on in.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Tom. It was a question actually for the point that Robin was making around, and the point you made around vice-chancellors or new vice-chancellors underestimating the amount of time or care and feeding that governance requires. Is there a lot of overlap with chief executives in other sectors in that respect, or is there something unique about higher education?
Robin, do you want to come in on this?
I think it is. It depends a bit on the nature of the business, but a lot of other sectors find that the chief executive does have to spend time with the board. I mean, both executive members of the board, if that's the case, and non-executive members as well.
My sense would be it's a much more complex landscape in HE, and therefore that demands, often if you're a non-exec and you're the chief exec, then it's often on finance and resources and issues of that nature. At HE, we have this much more complex landscape. John Rushworth, you must have a view on this, aren't you?
Yeah, I don't think it's the complexity of the landscape. I think that the key difference is, in other sectors, the board tends to be expert in the industry. The board quite often isn't an expert in this industry, so the VC and the exec team have to spend time educating, explaining to a greater degree, I would say.
Thank you, very helpful comment. Again, work in progress. The themes we highlighted looked as follows, and some of them are the 21 factors. Some are recoverable from. Nobody comes perfectly formed into this role, whether you've done the role before or not. There are some points from which you can recover, and there are points, I think, where it's pretty irrecoverable from. At a personal level, look, you start at P1, you've got gaps in your experience, no one comes perfect. You're having difficulty calibrating your frustrations in public arenas. You need a bit of help there. Lack of ability to plan and inspire, becoming a little problematic. Up to P4, you've made a few poor judgment calls on appointments, getting more difficult to recover from, but you can. Once we get into the next phase from P5, 6, and 7, we really are into the troublesome zone, and I don't need to reinforce that to you, of course. On the governance issues, you start with, actually, I'm not quite inadequate or unclear expectations of the head of university, the relationship with the chair deteriorating, trying to not getting the importance of shared governance, superficial relationship, and then we get into territory, which again, of course, we've seen in very extreme examples, but when they arise can be really problematic. And then the final territory, we're in the sort of context and come back to that mismatch between cultural and contextual mismatch, poor person organisation fit. At the beginning of that, well, do something to get up to speed with the organisation. Your test out your assumptions of what you thought the role was and the expectations of the board were, because if you can't, then there may well be a very early exit. Again, extreme, but we've seen them. Your values, yeah, you talk a good game, but you're not living them. Psychological safety in the team is difficult, so we really talk about the real issues. Stuff goes underground, shadow team dynamics become, we comply, but there's a lack of commitment. And again, as we get into the 5, 6, and 7, we really are into territory which is getting increasingly difficult to recover from. Now, as I say, many of these are simply the nature of coming into a role which you've never done before, or you've never done in the particular context, even if you've done it in another context. So watch out for these. You'll have seen many examples. Some of them are extreme, happen in very rare occasions. Others are just part and parcel of the transition into the role. And again, why we believe support is required at these different stages. So finally then, just to close, so we've got time for a few questions. I think your role increasingly becomes one of a different metaphor, a theatre metaphor. You're the set designer, making sure all of these different elements and component parts are thought about on a holistic system level, rather than as being intermittent and not as joined up as they might be. There's the choreography of the entire process is really vital to avoid what we see occasionally when actually we haven't given enough attention to supporting the team, or indeed the outgoing Vice-Chancellor for that matter, and begin to see the early warning signs of difficulties for the incoming candidate. Your role in a transition team coordinator and facilitator, doing work in advance of and with the support of the incoming Vice-Chancellor to accelerate their entry into role, hopefully, and reduce risk. And where appropriate, if you need it, then an advisor to work with you to also act as a speak truth to power as you do in your roles. So we started as we did at the beginning. I don't know if your view has changed since we had this brief conversation. We'll maybe do a quick straw poll at the end, but to avoid us not having time for further reflections, questions, and comments, let me open the floor to further thoughts from you. What comes to mind so far?